Imagine leaving a bank vault wide open, slapping an IOU pad on the table, and walking away.
Right, which sounds completely insane.
It sounds absolutely absurd. But when you look at the raw data from the pandemic, that is essentially what happened to the state of California.
Yeah, it really is.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into this massive financial vanishing act that hit the Golden State. We are talking about tens of billions of taxpayer dollars lost to outright fraud.
Oh, easily. The numbers are staggering.
Just to put the sheer scale of this in perspective for you, sources estimate the state lost $55 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims alone.
Just massive.
We've got state checks being mailed directly to inmates on death row. And, it doesn't even stop there. Billions more quietly vanish into healthcare and homelessness programs.
Yep.
So whether you live in California or you're just paying federal taxes, this directly impacts you. And you really need to hear how a system breaks down on this level.
You do. And we definitely have a really thick stack of sources to work through today.
We really do.
We're pulling from official reports by the California State Auditor, a comprehensive oversight report from the U.S. House Oversight Committee, and some really detailed investigative journalism pieces from City Journal and Cal Matters.
Oh, and the press releases, right.
Right. We've also got press releases and statements from various lawmakers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we need to be incredibly clear right up front here.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Several of these sources, particularly the City Journal report and legislative statements, they present very strong conservative critiques of Governor Gavin Newsom's administration.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is simply to impartially report the facts, the statistics, and, the specific claims presented in this material.
Right.
No spin.
We aren't here to take any political sides or endorse any particular viewpoint. We're just going to lay out what the data actually says and try to understand the mechanics of how a crisis of this magnitude actually happens.
Which is complicated. It is. So to do that, we have to start at the epicenter. We have to look at the Employment Development Department, or the EDD. That's the agency handling unemployment benefits. Let's look at the mechanics here. How exactly did the biggest vault get cracked?
Well, to understand the how, you have to look at a very specific policy choice made in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay.
Under former Labor Secretary Julie Su, the EDD was facing just a total avalanche of newly unemployed people.
Because of the lockdowns, right?
Exactly. So to handle the volume and avoid this massive backlog, the agency suspended its standard eligibility rules. They adopted a model that industry experts call pay and chase.
Meaning they approve the application and send the cash out immediately and then try to verify if the person was actually telling the truth later.
Effectively, yes. The primary goal was speed. They wanted to get the money out the door instantly. But the mechanism of the chase, part of that strategy,
Was it even there?
it was practically non-existent. Our sources show that despite the massive, unprecedented surge in applications, the EDD assigned exactly 2 bureaucrats to manually inspect reports of suspected fraud.
Wait, 2 people?
2 people.
For an entire state of nearly 40 million people.
Yeah, that was the entire team manually looking for fraud at that point.
I mean, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. We were in a once-in-a-century pandemic.
Sure.
Lockdowns were happening. People were terrified they wouldn't be able to feed their kids or pay their mortgages. So was this pay and chase model a case of gross negligence? Or was it a desperate triage decision where they just had to choose speed over security to keep the economy from completely collapsing?
Well, that's the core debate right there.
Yeah.
The administration's argument at the time was exactly what you just said. If they didn't push the money out immediately, people would literally starve and lose their homes.
Right.
But the U.S. House Oversight Committee report heavily critiques this. They frame it as a deliberate, disastrous choice that entirely ignored obvious catastrophic risks.
Because they only had 2 people checking.
Because the EDD only had 2 people manually reviewing fraud, the system was essentially defenseless. The EDD eventually admitted to $55 billion in improper payments.
$55 billion. That's just hard to wrap your head around.
The front door was left so wide open that fraudsters didn't even have to try hard. People successfully claimed benefits using incredibly obvious fake names like John Doe and, I kid you not, Poopy Britches.
You really can't make this stuff up. Poopy Britches.
It's in the reports.
I mean, if you're using a name like that and a government check actually arrives in the mail, the system isn't just broken, it's virtually non-existent.
Completely.
And this wasn't just small-time scammers, right? The sources highlight that international crime rings moved in, but the detail that really stands out to me involves the state's own prison system.
Oh, yeah. This is perhaps the most shocking statistic in the auditor's report. Over 35,000 unemployment claims were paid out in the names of state prisoners. Wow. State officials estimate between $810 million and $1 billion was lost to claims filed on behalf of incarcerated people.
$1 billion to people in prison.
And that includes over $421,000 paid directly to 133 inmates currently sitting on death row.
Wait, death row?
Yes. Convicted murderers, including Scott Peterson, were receiving state unemployment checks.
Okay, this is where the mechanics of this get really interesting to me. Because if the pay and chase policy opened the door, why didn't the state's technology step in to catch the most glaring errors?
Well,
I mean, California is the undisputed tech capital of the world, yet its government seems to be running on, like, steam-powered tech. How does a state that invented the modern smartphone fail to cross-reference a basic spreadsheet to see if an applicant is literally locked in a state penitentiary?
that's a great question, and it really highlights how a lack of infrastructure creates vulnerability. It's like trying to run modern banking software on a Nintendo 64. The EDD's IT systems were so outdated, they simply lacked the software capacity to automatically ping the state's own prison rosters and match the names against incoming applications.
Are you serious?
Yeah. California was one of only 15 states in the entire country that didn't have this basic verification system functioning.
So the system physically couldn't process the cross-checks even if the agency wanted it to?
Exactly. And the dysfunction wasn't just technical, it's administrative. The House Oversight Report details how the EDD constantly ignored federal deadlines for data reporting, citing these really vague data defects.
Data defects.
Right. At one point, auditors found literal piles of unopened mail sitting in EDD offices. So while sophisticated fraudsters were getting their John Doe claims approved instantly online, millions of legitimate workers were having their benefits delayed.
Just because their physical paperwork was sitting in a pile gathering dust?
Exactly.
And according to the CalMatters reports, when the EDD finally realized they were hemorrhaging billions of dollars, their reaction wasn't exactly precise. They completely panicked, right?
They did. They swung entirely in the opposite direction.
What did they do?
The EDD directed Bank of America, which was issuing the debit cards for the state benefits, to suddenly freeze 344,000 accounts.
Wow.
But they executed this freeze without any targeted plan to differentiate the real accounts from the fraudulent ones.
So they basically just pulled the emergency brake on the entire train.
Exactly. They completely cut off hundreds of thousands of legitimate, struggling workers with zero warning. And they had no clear pathway to selectively unfreeze the accounts of innocent people.
Did the state legislature try to step in and force a technological fix? It seems like mandating a prison cross-check would be step one, right?
They did try. And there is some important political context here from the press releases. Republican lawmakers proposed a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 39.
Okay.
That bill would have legally mandated the EDD to cross-check all claims against prison records before paying out a dime.
That seems like an absolute no-brainer. What happened to it?
The bill was officially shelved by Assembly Democrats in the Appropriations Committee.
Wait, why?
Well, the Appropriations Committee essentially acts as the financial gatekeepers of the state legislature. They decide which bills actually get funded and move forward. Because they shelved it, the technological mandate just stalled out.
Wow.
And the ongoing administrative chaos is so severe that the U.S. Department of Labor has now launched a specialized federal strike team just to probe California's continuing issues.
So the EDD was clearly a disaster. But if we connect this to the bigger picture in the sources, the EDD wasn't just an isolated incident, was it?
No, not at all.
We've got the California State Auditor's high-risk list, and it paints a picture of a systemic problem stretching across the entire government.
That's right. The EDD was really just the loudest alarm bell. If you look at the investigative report from City Journal, they estimate a staggering $180 billion has been lost to fraud and waste across all California state programs.
$180 billion. That number is so large it almost loses its meaning.
It's hard to process.
Let's break down the mechanics of how you actually lose that much money. Where else is this cash vanishing? Let's start with Medi-Cal, the state's healthcare program for low-income residents.
Okay.
The City Journal report notes that spending on Medi-Cal has more than doubled under the current administration, hitting $196.7 billion. How exactly does spending double, and how does fraud infiltrate a healthcare program to that extent?
It comes back to the exact same mechanism we saw at the EDD, removing the gatekeepers to speed things up.
Okay.
The state loosened a lot of operational restrictions during the pandemic. For example, they suspended certain requirements for doctors to get prior authorization for treatments.
Let's define that really quickly for the listener. Prior authorization is basically when a doctor has to ask the state's permission before ordering an expensive procedure, right?
Precisely. Usually, if a clinic wants to bill the state for an expensive MRI, the state reviews it first and says yes or no. When you remove that prior authorization step, you are essentially giving healthcare providers a blank check. A bad actor can bill the state for thousands of phantom MRI scans or expensive treatments that never actually happened.
And the system just pays it.
Yeah, the system automatically pays the invoice because the check first step was deleted.
Wow. So by removing the friction to get people faster care, they also removed the only barrier stopping fraudulent billing.
Exactly. And because those rules were relaxed, experts cited in the City Journal report estimate the fraud rate in medical hit somewhere between 15% and 25%.
That's huge.
When you do the math on a nearly $200 billion budget, that means up to $146 billion in taxpayer funds might have been lost to Medi-Cal fraud since 2019.
And we also have a press release from Republican Representative Young Kim highlighting issues on the federal side of that healthcare spending.
Yes. Representative Kim highlights a report from federal auditors showing California improperly claimed $1.3 billion in federal Medicaid funds.
How so?
Well, the claim is that the state used this federal money to provide non-emergency care for undocumented immigrants. And that directly violates federal eligibility. A single vote in the U.S. Senate can freeze the most powerful government on earth.
So in healthcare, the massive fraud was driven by removing gatekeepers.
A political standoff threatens to blow up the rules forever.
But California has another massive
we are watching the
crisis
fundamental
where
machinery of American
spending, and that's
lawmaking just
homelessness.
grind
The state
to
dumps
an absolute
$24
halt.
billion
And honestly, the
into
physical
homelessness
toll on the
programs
people
over a
inside
few
that
short
building
years.
is about to become
Did the
very
same
real.
lack of gatekeeping
Right, so let's
lead
set
to
the
the same
scene.
result there?
It's March 2026. It's a very similar pattern. Picture the hallways of the United States Capitol right now. With homelessness, the state are literally dragging military-style web of nonprofits and private contractors to build housing and
Staffers
provide
are
services.
stockpiling energy drinks by
But the state auditor
We're looking at a
admitted they
scenario
lack
where
the
senators
fundamental
might
data
actively
to
refuse
track
to
the
drink water
outcomes of that $24
just so they don't have to
billion.
leave the floor to use the
They literally
restroom.
don't know what works and what
and it's
doesn't
all because the
the
Senate
oversight
is
isn't there.
completely
I really want
deadlocked
to focus
over
on
the
how that
Save It
actually works
America
on the
Act.
ground.
Right, that
Because
big
if you hand
election
out
overhaul
$24
bill.
billion
Yeah.
It's centered
to a
around
network of
measures like
contractors
voter
without
ID
strict
requirements.
oversight, what
Democrats are
happens?
aggressively
The money
blocking this
simply vanishes
legislation,
into the
and
administrative
Republicans
gaps.
desperately want to pass it. For
But they
example,
lack the 60
prosecutors
votes required
allege
to
an
break the
executive at an
stalemate.
affordable
Which
housing
means
developer
frustrations
called
are just
Shangri-La Industries
boiling over.
embezzled
Today,
you have
$2.2
28
million
Republican senators,
of
people
state
like Pete
housing
Ricketts
funds.
and
Oh,
Cynthia
wow.
Lummis, he allegedly
demanding
used the taxpayer
that the
money
Senate
to
force
buy
exotic
grueling
cars
physical
and a
massive
massive
filibuster.
A
They
mansion.
want to force
If the state is
Democrats
spending
to stand on the
$24
floor
billion
and talk
on
until their vocal
homelessness,
cords
how
just
does
give
a
out. And if that
$2.2
fails,
million
they want to
mansion
break the standing
quietly
rules
get
of the Senate
purchased without tripping a
entirely
single
to force
alarm?
a final
just gets
vote.
lost.
And the real shocker
It
dropped
feels like looking
just a few
for
days
a
ago.
missing drop
Senator
of water
John
in the
Cornyn,
ocean.
a
And this
man
lack
who
of oversight
fiercely
extends
defended
to
the
food
old
stamp
Senate rules
program
for his
too, right?
entire
Cal
career,
Fresh?
yes, just
The
published
state
this
auditor recently
fiery
added the
op-ed
Department of
Right,
Social
saying
Services,
Republicans
which
must
runs
act
CalFresh,
now to
to
get
their
this bill
high-risk
passed.
list.
Yeah, he
Okay,
said
why?
they have to deal
The
a
issue
fatal
there
blow
is
to the rules,
incredibly high error
which
rates
instantly
in
triggered a
calculating
massive
food
public
benefits.
call-out from
Those
former
administrative
Senator Joe
errors are
Manchin.
so frequent that they
Manchin
could
slammed
force the
Cornyn
state
on
to
line
spend
for
up to
well, a
$2.5
massive
billion
Because the rules of the
annually
Senate are quite
just to
literally
cover
hanging
federal
by a
penalties
thread
for
right now.
overpayment
I mean, the
fraud.
decisions
So
made
we've
in the
got
next few
hackers,
days will dictate
we've got
how American
international
laws are
crime
written for
rings
the next
exploiting
century.
the EDD,
Welcome
and
to
we
this
have
deep dive.
contractors buying
Today,
mansions
we have
with
a
housing
custom mission
funds.
tailored just
a
for
lot.
you.
But the
We're
whistleblower
going to
reports from
explore
the
the
state auditor point to
swashbuckling,
something that feels even
pirate-filled
more
origins
dangerous.
of the filibuster.
A significant amount of
crazy
this
history.
waste and
It really
fraud
is.
is an inside
We'll also
job.
break down the
insider
terrifying
threat is
parliamentary
massive.
weapon known as the
And
nuclear
it
option.
illustrates a core
And
principle
finally,
in
we will unpack
cybersecurity
a
and
mind-bending
administration,
mathematical
which is that
concept
access
called the
is the
Manning dimension paradox.
Right, which
You could
proves
build all the
exactly why
external firewalls
politicians
you
use
want,
gridlock
but if
as
an
a
employee
highly
has
calculated
administrative access on the
mathematical
inside, the system is
strategy.
completely
So,
defenseless.
by the end
Give
of
me a
this
specific
conversation,
example from the
you will hold
sources
the
of how
secret
this
decoder
insider
ring
access was
for the
exploited.
chaos you see
Let's
on the
look
news.
back at the EDD
You will
fraud.
understand the
It wasn't
hidden
just
game
random
people
theory
on the internet
that
guessing
drives
Social
these
Security
high-stakes
numbers. In one
showdowns.
investigative
Absolutely.
instance,
Okay,
a
let's
call
unpack
center
this.
agent
Before we can
employed by an
truly
EDD
grasp the
contractor
physical
was
threats and the
actually
massive
working
stakes
directly with her
of this
boyfriend.
2026
boyfriend?
FZV
He was a
America
state
Act
prison inmate
standoff.
serving a life sentence.
We
for
really
murder.
need to look at what the
Unbelievable.
filibuster
Together.
actually is.
He
And more
stole the
importantly, how it
identities of other
started.
California
Right,
prisoners.
because it wasn't designed this
Because
way
she
by
had
the founders,
administrative
right?
access
Like this
to
wasn't
the
in the
EDD's
blueprint.
internal
Not at all.
systems.
If you read the
She
U.S.
could bypass
Constitution, you
all
will
the
not find
standard
the word
verifications
filibuster
and
anywhere
push
in the
through
text.
fake
nowhere.
unemployment
Nowhere.
claims for
The
those stolen
Constitution
identities.
basically gives the Senate the authority to
And
set
our
its own
sources
internal
note this
rules.
isn't unique
So
to
back in
California.
1789,
Similar
during the very
insider
first
rings
sessions,
exploiting
debates
administrative
ended with
access
just a
were
simple
busted
majority
in
vote.
states like
Okay,
New York
so
and Massachusetts.
51 votes
That
and you're
is
done.
genuinely terrifying.
But there was this massive
But you know, it's not
loophole.
always
They
criminal
never
masterminds stealing
codified a
identities,
specific
is it?
procedure
No.
to
The
force
sources
a vote
outline
to
a
happen
concept that we
if
could
someone
call
simply refused to
administrative
stop
debt.
talking.
Just plain,
So without a
everyday
mechanism to cut off
administrative
debate,
incompetence that slowly drains
Politicians
the
figured out
budget.
they could just,
Administrative
you know,
debt is a
hold the floor
fantastic way to
hostage.
frame
They
it.
did.
Beyond
We
the act of
actually have
criminal
diaries from
fraud,
the
the
very
state is
first session
bleeding
of the
millions
Senate.
of dollars because they
Pennsylvania
simply
Senator
failed to
William
update their
McClay
internal
wrote down his
paperwork.
sheer
Like what?
frustration
Well,
that senators
the
from
auditor
Virginia were
found one
intentionally
state
talking
agency
away the clock.
wasted
Just to make sure a
$4.6
specific
billion
bill
on
couldn't pass.
cell phones.
Right.
How
They
do you do
literally
that?
They paid the
weaponized
monthly
the clock.
service fees.
I mean,
for
if they were holding the
6,200
legislative
mobile
process
phones,
hostage,
it sat
it makes perfect
completely
sense why the
unused in
press eventually
storage for
started
over
calling
4
them
years.
pirates.
4 years.
Which brings us to the
no
actual
one
word
audited a phone bill for
filibuster.
4
Yeah,
years.
it's
Not a
easily one
single
of the
person.
strangest words in American
And in
politics.
another case,
So where does it
an
come
agency
from?
overpaid
The
a
etymology
retired
is
employee
fascinating,
by
honestly. The term really took hold in the
$170,000.
1850s.
How exactly does a
It comes
system
from the Dutch
accidentally
word
pay a retired
freebooter
person
and the Spanish word filibustero.
It
Which
happens
translates
when
directly to
basic
freebooter
data
or
entry
pirate,
fails.
right?
Yes.
The agency simply failed
Specifically,
to track
the
his leave
mercenaries and
hours in their
pirates
system.
who raided
Okay.
Caribbean
stopped
islands
working.
and Latin American countries
But because the
during
human
that
resources
era,
paperwork
So they were
was
calling
never
these
updated
distinguished
to reflect
senators
his retirement,
pirates.
the
Pretty
automated
much.
system just kept
the
cutting
term
in
entered the
paychecks for another
political
15
lexicon
months.
because
Oh my
observers
goodness.
recognized
The auditor
behavior.
also found state
Senators who
managers
talked for
systematically
hours
misusing
were literally
state-owned
hijacking the
vehicles
Senate
for
floor.
personal
Like
errands,
taking the government
like
hostage,
driving
just
their
like a
kids to
pirate
school
taking over a ship.
and hiding the
Exactly.
trips by falsifying
So let's
their
track
travel
how the
logs.
Senate tried
It's like
to
looking
fight
at a
off these
failing
legislative
municipal water
pirates.
system. You've got a
Because as
massive
the country
burst water
grew,
main
I
with
mean,
the
you couldn't just
EDD
have
fraud
one person
flooding
shut
the
down the
entire
entire
street.
government for
Right.
weeks
But
on end.
you also
No,
have
you couldn't.
thousands of
But it took a
tiny,
long time to build a
unpatched
defense.
drips like
By the
paying
early
for
20th
unused cell
century, these
phones,
marathon
unearned
speeches
retirement
became
checks, or
catastrophic
managers
for
using state
modernizing
cars for
nation.
school
I can
drop-offs.
imagine.
So finally,
Individually,
in
they look like small
1917,
mistakes,
President
but
Woodrow
together,
Wilson
they are
pushed the
slowly
Senate to
draining
adopt
the
Rule
entire
22.
reservoir dry.
That
This
perfectly
rule created
captures
a
the
formal
reality
process
the
called
state auditor
cloture.
is warning
Cloture,
about.
Yeah.
When an
Which is
agency
simply a
receives that
mechanism to force
official
an end to
high-risk
debate.
label from the
But
auditor,
here's the catch.
it means there are
required
deeply
a
rooted
massive
systemic conditions of
majority
waste,
vote to trigger.
fraud,
Two-thirds,
abuse,
wow,
or
which is an incredibly
mismanagement.
steep hill
And
to
how many
climb.
have that label?
So
Right
stiff
now,
that
8
over the
different
next 4
agencies or
decades,
statewide
the
issues
Senate
carry
only
that
managed to
high-risk label
successfully
in
invoke
California.
cloture
So we have
5
this
times.
sprawling,
That is
system-wide
wild.
problem of
Southern
outdated
senators
tech,
famously used
administrative
this
debt, and
exact
practically
tool to
zero
block
oversight.
civil rights legislation.
Where does the
for
state go
years.
from here?
The
Does
gridlock
Governor
grew
Newsom's
so intense
administration have
that
a
in
plan to plug the
1975,
Well,
the
the
Senate
administration
lowered
is
that
pivoting
threshold
hard
from
toward
2/3 down to
modernization.
60.
Governor
out of the
Newsom recently issued an
100
executive
total
order to
senators.
integrate generative artificial
okay.
intelligence
And
into
that
state
60 vote
operations.
threshold is the
Let's
number
clarify
that
that for
dominates our
everyone.
politics
Generative
today.
AI being
Exactly.
advanced
But
algorithms
here's
that
where I
can
think a lot of people
automatically
get
generate
confused.
text,
When we
write
hear the word
code,
filibuster,
or make
we
complex
don't just think of a
decisions based on
60-vote
huge
math
sets
problem.
of data.
We picture
Right. Jimmy
the stated
Stewart
goal
and Mr.
is
Smith
to
goes
use
to
this
Washington.
AI
Right,
to
the
speed
classic
up the
movie
state's
scene.
cumbersome
We picture a
procurement
single
processes
person standing at
and
a
help
podium,
frontline
reading the phone
workers
book,
manage their
sweating,
caseloads.
refusing to sit down.
They've also launched an
But senators
innovation
rarely
fellows
do that
program.
anymore. Why don't
The
they
idea
have to
there
physically
is to bring
talk
in
to them?
high-level
That
tech
is is a
executives
crucial
from the
piece of the
private
puzzle.
sector
So
to
in the
embed within state
1970s, the
agencies,
Senate
find
created something
efficiencies,
called the
and build
two-track
stronger,
system.
Two-track
modern
system. How did that
digital
work?
services.
Well,
Hasn't worked at
before
all
the
yet.
system,
The
a
administration
filibuster
claims they are
stopped
already
all Senate
using
business
advanced machine
completely.
learning models
Nothing
that
else
have
could
correctly
happen. The
identified
Senate
and
realized
reduced
they had a whole
electronic
country
benefit
to
theft
run, so
by
they changed
over
the procedure.
80%.
Makes sense.
Okay, so the
Under the new
strategy
system,
is
if a senator simply
essentially
threatened to
trying to
filibuster
port
a bill,
Silicon Valley's
the Senate
mindset
leadership would
directly
just
into
set that
Sacramento's
controversial bill
bureaucracy.
aside on a different
But
track
based
and move
on
on
everything
to
we've
other
just discussed
business.
today,
Oh,
that feels a
wow.
bit like
So they made it
building a
painless.
high-tech penthouse
You didn't have to
on
stand
top
up
of a
and destroy your
termite-infested
vocal cords
foundation.
anymore. You just
That
sent
is
an email
exactly the
saying,
core
"I
tension
object,"
our
and the
sources
bill was
highlight.
frozen. The administration is
silent
trying
filibuster.
to build
You capture
this
the dynamic
incredibly
perfectly.
advanced
The physical endurance
AI-driven
requirement
future.
basically vanished.
But They are doing records from before and outside that own auditor has officially diagnosed.
Those remain pretty legendary.
Fundamentally broken and high
Strom
risk
Thurmond spoke
across
against
8
the
different
Civil Rights
sectors.
Act in
And this is exactly
1957
why this
for
deep dive
24
matters
hours
to you,
in the
the
Imagine
listener.
finding out your
Whether you
24
pay
hours
taxes in
is
California
the
or
modern
not,
individual
this is
record
fundamentally a
statutory
story
book
about
edition.
how your money is managed by the
In
shocking
April
realization when you
2025,
actually look at the
Booker
math.
spoke
Right.
for an
astonishing
astonishing
imagine for a
25-hour
second that you
emergency
have a
committee
savings account.
completely
against the
overrides
policies of the
and,
Donald Trump administration.
When a
I mean, just
government
think
rushes
about
to
it.
push
Why would
massive
you
amounts of money out the door
This
without
money
checking
was
IDs,
strictly for
or
families
removes
you
the
can lean
gatekeepers
on
in
your
healthcare
desk.
You can't even leave the chamber
people
for
who
a
actually
bathroom
need the
break.
help
It
most
is a
often
house
get
of
pushed
brutal,
aside by
dangerous
organized crime
times.
crisis and
for the
opportunistic
house.
Exactly.
success.
And to save the house,
It really reminds
incredibly
you of
expensive
car
car
breaks
down
train
in the
Who
reality
decides
of
the just
you've
ratio.
got bills
Yank,
piling up.
you can have the best intentions in the
Everyone
world,
else
roof
if
to
your
the
IT
walls, just
systems
because
they
they
Take that
operate
money,
like
pay
we're
off
in
your
the
credit cards, and
1990s.
tell your
It
family
is a
you
highly
two people in
disruptive
charge of
maneuver.
fraud
Right.
prevention
That
for an
raises
entire
this
state.
question, though.
The
The catastrophic
outcome
is
is
so
entirely
disruptive.
difficult.
It leads
Every
us with
car
a
is a
really
massive
provocative question to
self-inflicted
think about
hate.
as
One
we
legislation
wrap up today.
$5 billion.
If
Why
an
haven't they just
administrative
voted
system
to
is
destroy
so
it?
completely avoidable,
That
flawed,
is the
that
core
international
Welcome to the
criminals
deep
in the
dive.
United States Senate
Today
is
we're
there.
exploring
The
a
reason the
classic
filibuster
case of
survives
sleight
is
of
that
hand
permanently
coming out of
destroying it
Annapolis.
requires a
Does
maneuver
We're
so
plugging
looking at the
advanced
strategic
and so
energy
destructive
investment
to the
fund.
institution
actually
that it
fix
earned
the
a
root
terrifying
problem?
It's a
nickname.
huge pot of money.
Or does it just
meant
build
to
a
save
fast,
the
new,
environment.
smarter
But
machine
it sounds
that's
like
still
a war
fundamentally
threat.
broken at
Let's
its
walk
core?
through the actual
That is the multi-billion-dollar question
How
in
does a
Maryland.
party
Something for you
actually
to
It really
mull
is.
over.
It's become the
Until
center
next
of
time,
a
thanks for
huge
breaking down the
political
fight.
parliamentary cheat
You've
code.
got